Well, good morning, everybody. Glad you joined us for a most interesting webinar with regards to what cyber insurance expects of me. This is a topic that, while on the surface it might seem really dry, yet it's really important because every one of us who takes out cyber insurance really wants that policy to pay off if we have a need for it. But if the policy is going to pay off, what does the policy expect of us to do? That's what this webinar is going to address. And I think you're going to learn some things in it too as we talk about. So let's start out as we talk about what cyber insurance is. Let's begin by talking about the question, what exactly is cybersecurity? You know, if you talk to, I've been in presentations before, seminars before, I've given them, and I've asked people what they think cybersecurity is and what they think about it. And virtually everybody's tired of hearing it. I'm going to suggest a better definition for us to work from as we think about cybersecurity. And that is simply this, that cybersecurity is simply a form of risk management. We all do risk management, whether it be fixing our roofs or being sure our sidewalks are cleaned off from ice, or being sure that we've got some kind of protections on our financial records. We all consider some kind of risk management. And so cybersecurity, as we deal with this topic, is really just simply another form of risk management. Specifically, cyber insurance is going to be one of those things that deals with anything related to IT and OT. So if you process payments, payment processor would be in scope. If you're dealing with customers, client information, if you're dealing with anything else, the business information you have, lots of different things come to it. But it all comes down that cybersecurity is simply a form of risk management. And specifically, as we talk about risk management, it's going to deal with risk management around anything related to IT and OT. Now, let me make a comment for you guys live. Feel free to type in questions into the question box as you see that. And obviously, you feel free to get in touch with us later if you have any questions on this. I see Shauna's already monitoring the question box, so that's great. Thank you, Shauna. So let's start out and talk about how in the world do I manage cyber risk? Well, different people use different ways to talk about this topic. I'm going to use the suggestions that I learned when we talked about managing risk. And that is that anytime we manage risk, we really have three ways that as an individual or as a business that we can treat risk. On the one hand, we might accept it. We might say that's just something we're going to have to deal with and just leave it like that and recognize that that's just a risk that we're going to have to handle. Accepting risk is indeed a valid way of dealing with things. Accepting risk is quite a very valid way for us to handle things. And if, in your perspective, certain types of cyber risk are indeed worth just accepting, that is a valid answer. You might recall that from the webinar that was done last month that we talked about ways you can calculate your risk using the Chubb Cyber Index. And so as you talk about accepting risk, that might be something that a person would want to look at. But besides just deciding to accept cyber risk, you can also make a choice to mitigate or to reduce cyber risk. With regards to cybersecurity and cyber risk, you basically have three different types of controls that you can use to mitigate cyber risk. On the one hand, you might choose to use some kinds of things with regards to people. This might involve training on how to use certain programs or training on certain practices that you want to put into place or training on basic cyber awareness and those kinds of things. But you also, in order to mitigate risk, probably want to include some kind of policy statements. You may want to make a policy that everything wraps around and involves MFA, that you have to have it, that's a requirement. You want to make a policy that no changes are made to bank account information without at least two people signing off. That might be a policy. You might make a policy that you don't receive any requests for gift cards from outside the company, as that might be a way you want to do it. But the third way you might want to mitigate risk is with technical controls. Now, this is where a lot of things fall down for many folks. because the tendency is to think that technical controls are going to be the one-stop, end-all, be-all that's going to solve our cybersecurity problems. And so we just think if we added another thing or another box or another device or another program, that will take care of all of our cyber risk. And that's not true. People, policy, and technical controls are all three components that are necessary to help manage cyber risk. And every one of them plays a very important role. You need all three. You can't get away without having it. But the third way that we can manage cyber risk, the third way we can decide to accept risk, we can decide to try to mitigate or reduce risk, or we can try to transfer that risk. And that's where insurance comes into play. We transfer risk all the time. My homeowner's insurance transfers risk on hail damage for my roof to the insurance company where they will pay off if we get pounded with a hailstorm. We transfer risk with auto insurance that if we have a wreck, that there's going to be something that's going to pay for it rather than us having to pay for the wreck out of pocket. With regards to cyber insurance, we may want to transfer certain kinds of risk to cyber insurance, knowing that we pay a premium and then the insurance company will come back and cover some things. But when you look at cyber insurance and look at transferring risks, you need to look at a couple things. First off, you need to look at what kinds of risks are you actually transferring. Some policies only cover a very specified and small amount of things. Some policies are a general coverage and handle much broader specifications. We'll talk about what those policies can require in just a few minutes as we move on down. But no matter what you try to do, if you transfer cyber risk, you also need to look at and ask the question, is the potential risk payout from the insurance company sufficient to cover what the risk would be? So many cyber insurance policies have a cap on them. Common one that I see is $2 million. So if you've got $2 million, ask yourself the question, is that $2 million sufficient to cover, for example, the cost of a ransomware attack? You may recall that some of the big ransomware attacks around our part of Kansas recently, that the entities have come out and talked about. One entity talked about their ransomware attack they expected to cost over $400 million. That's a lot of money, and obviously that's out of my budget. So, but the question you have to ask is your cyber insurance enough to cover your risk? Many people, when they sit down and do the numbers, discover that it's not. And so you actually, when you talk about cyber risk, you actually have to use a combination of accepting certain amounts, and that's where your board, if you have it, or your leadership team comes into play to say, do they want to accept this amount of risk? You may have to reduce the risk or mitigate it, and that's where your people and your policy and your technical controls come into place. And then you've got transference, whether it be just to one policy or how you build your policy structure out. So as we're talking about managing cyber risk and talking about what cyber insurance expects, it might help to step back and ask the question, what kind of cyber risks does my organization actually face? Well, the main cyber risks that we see that businesses face, as we deal with businesses all the time, is that, first off, ransomware. It is a huge risk. And we see people constantly having attacks or being hit by ransomware. It is extremely, it is a big risk that every business faces. But every business also faces the threat of insider malpractice. I knew one organization, for example, that did not do backups of their endpoints like they should. And so when one particular employee got mad and quit, this employee totally erased the disk drive, which included certain copies of contracts, which the only copy was on that laptop, and other items that were destroyed and reused. The insider threat is a very real thing. So as you talk about cyber risk, you've got ransomware on the outside. You've got the potential of an insider threat on the inside, somebody that wants to do harm or walks out the door with bad feelings or whatever. Then if you get data that's exposed, you've got the risk of personally identifiable information, PII, that's exposed. Interestingly enough, every single state in the union has some kind of data exposure laws, even including Kansas. And so as you talk about what those data exposure laws require, it's really worth your time to have some idea of what the exposure is and what the requirements are. Then if you happen to have data for people from other states, suddenly you find other state frameworks become involved and even GDPR. So you've got a huge galaxy of different laws and regulations that come around this personally identifiable information exposure. But besides that, you may also face the threat of business data exposure. You may find out that you don't want your trade secrets, or you don't want the way you do business, or you don't want your contracts or your main client base or any of those things exposed. That's the cyber risk that you face. And you may have clients who wouldn't appreciate it if it was known that they were doing business and who all they were doing business with. So business data exposure is likewise a big risk. But probably the fifth big main risk that every single one of us faces is that risk of equipment or cloud failure. We all remember what happened when CrowdStrike released a bad update here a few weeks ago and how it brought down many, many big businesses. I'm not in that category. You may not be either, but nevertheless, if our networks are down, if our equipment fails or our cloud SaaS services fail or something like that, then we do face the risk of cyber something or other as a result of all of our cloud services failing. So that's a main risk. Then in addition, if you have a particular business sector, you may find that you have some sort of sector-specific risks that are involved. And then besides those main five we talked about, there are many other risks that a person faces. So as you talk about the risk that your organization faces, and as you talk about how you're going to deal with that risk, whether it be through acceptance, mitigation, or transference, let's stop for a minute and focus down just on the transference piece. In other words, if I do buy a cyber insurance policy, if my policy does indeed cover my business, and knowing these threats that I all face, what in the world is my cyber insurance policy going to expect of me? Okay, and this is where it gets kind of interesting. You find out that there's a patchwork of laws across the state or across our various states. You find out that every single state has data breach requirements, but a handful of states have gone farther to define some kind of information security standards. Okay. And then even on the national level, you've got national laws specifically with regards to sectors, but also generally that come into play. But even as you look at all of these things that come out, you find out that no one law has been written to define what should be expected. So at this point, here's what we find. If you're involved with, if you take out cyber insurance policy, and if you are in some kind of a regulated industry, and you find that that's more and more people that have that all the time, whether it be the FTC safeguard rules, whether it be NERC CIP, whether it be HIPAA, PCI, whatever it is, CMMC, take your pick of frameworks. You find that the first thing is that all policies expect you to meet any applicable compliance frameworks. So if you take out a cyber insurance policy and you're under, let's say, NERC CIP or whatever, and you decide not to meet certain requirements, then your policy is not going to pay for your lack of meeting the requirements. Your policies all expect you to meet any applicable compliance frameworks. There's no way to get out of that. All policies do. And so if you're not meeting those frameworks and those requirements, that's a problem between you and your cyber insurance company that you're going to face. But in addition, as we've looked at cyber insurance policies over the years, we probably looked at 3 dozen, something like that. As we've read it and looked at policies, find out that some policies outline actual specifics on what they think that you should do. And they'll have a checklist. of things that you should do written right into the policy. For example, we've seen policies that specify you use multi-factor authentication and that you have to have that involved in everything that you do. So if you're running a business and you've got this policy and your policy states you have to have MFA involved, and you decide that MFA is too cumbersome, so you're not going to do it, you are right off the bat in violation of the requirements of your policy, and you cannot expect your policy to pay out. We've seen policies that have some kind of statement regarding backup practices, whether or not you're going to make backups, how often, where the backups are stored, what you do as far as recovery attempts, all those kinds of things. And so if you're under a requirement like that, but you're not doing it, including not doing testing of your backups, then you can't expect your policy to pay out if you're not doing what they say are the requirements. We have seen cyber policies that have an end-of-life type of requirement. So for example, we've seen cyber insurance policies that specify that you cannot have any end-of-life software within your organization. Well, what's end of life? End of life is going to be software that is no longer supported and no longer receiving regular updates from the authors or the company that puts it out or whoever's the company behind it. But none of us like to buy new software, right? We want to keep using the stuff we have. But if we keep using the stuff we have, and our policy specifies that we don't have end-of-life software, and I've actually seen this written into stuff. If our policies state we don't have end-of-life software, and yet we insist on using end-of-life, an old version of Visual C++ redistributed, for example, or whatever it is, if we are using that, we're in trouble because our policy says don't, and so we can't expect our policy to pay off. Sometimes you'll see policies that specify something like threat hunting, where you're actually actively going out and looking to see if there's something on your network that shouldn't be there and looking for the bad stuff or evidence of guys getting in. Okay, so if you've got a policy that outlines specifics, in many ways, that policy that outlines specifics is going to be easier for you because you know exactly what you have to do. But remember, even if it outlines specifics, you've got to do that first point. You've got to meet any applicable compliance frameworks first. You just can't get around that. You absolutely have to do that no matter what. But then here's where the fun begins. And this is the real heart of what we're talking about today. While all policies expect you to meet compliance requirements, and while some policies outline specifics, more and more we're seeing that policy specifies something called a reasonable standard expectation. So in other words, the insurance policy, rather than having an outline, will just have some kind of a general statement that the customer is expected to meet a reasonable standards definition in order for cyber insurance to cover them. And if you're like me, you look at reasonable standards and you say, what in the world are we talking about? And you're not the only one. This has been the subject of a lot of conversation. What is a reasonable standards expectation? What does that mean? Well, it's interesting because while we're not the only ones that have asked that, there is no single law, there is no single applicable framework, no single national statute that defines minimum information security requirements. So at this point, if you have a policy that states that you need to meet reasonable standards, at this point, there is no national standard that tells you exactly what that is and defines what it is that you should be looking for. And that's a problem. The good news for us is that a group called the Center for Internet Security, CIS, has attempted to define what the reasonable standards are. And in fact, they've even gone as far as to create a reasonableness policy checklist. And everything that they've done is based upon the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls. So let's back up and talk about what we're talking about. First question that we should all ask is, why do I care what the Center for Internet Security says? The Center for Internet Security, or CIS, is a nonprofit that works a lot in cybersecurity, but also runs at least two of the ISACs for the federal government. The MS-ISAC, the multi-state ISAC, as well as the elections ISAC, are both run out of the Center for Internet Security. They've got tie-ins with many of the other big federal organizations, and so they know what they're talking about. One of the things that they steward and care for is something that's on the last line called the critical security controls. The critical security controls have been, I've probably known about them for 20 years as they've started out and gone through various revisions, and they become an absolutely wonderful framework to help define and help secure your networks. The critical security controls, when you get down through, they have different implementation groups. If you want to talk about how to implement the critical security controls, give us a call. We'd be happy to do that. But they're an absolutely wonderful framework to use to help define and help lock down what standards are as you in your organization try to meet cybersecurity. So the Centers for Internet Security has put together this long document, it's roughly 80 pages long, where they sat down to define what reasonable security is. They do it by going back and looking through both the national laws as well as the state laws, finding out applicable elements in these that seem to be common, look at various legal events that have taken place. And from this, they've sat down and created a definition of what reasonable security, reasonable standards mean, including towards the end of this one, the appendices, what they call a reasonableness policy checklist. In other words, as they're looking at this, they've helped us define and understand what a reasonable standards requirement is, and then help us define and understand how in the world are we going to meet a reasonable standards requirement. Now, this is gold, okay? This is gold because this gives you something to shoot for rather than simply just shooting in the wind and wondering, are we meeting this particular requirement? We've got some help to figure out what's going on. So how do I set about, and if my policy has a reasonable standard requirement, which is getting to be more and more common, how do I meet that? Well, first step, we would begin by implementing the practices as defined in the Center for Internet Security Guide, and we'll give you the URL to this stuff here in just a minute on that. We begin by implementing that. And so these practices are going to be a combination of the people, the policy, and the technical stuff that we talked about earlier. And they help you understand as you look at the people, the policy, and the tech, exactly what it is that I need to put into place in order to meet a reasonable standard guideline. Great document, great plan that they've done. But the second thing that we're starting to see more and more, we've had at this point 2 clients have seen this happen, and I expect that we'll see it more, is that besides implementing the practices, you're going to need to document proof to show compliance over time. For example, we got a request from a risk management organization for a large client wanting to know if we could show proof that backups have been done on a certain holiday weekend at a certain time. Okay, well, it just so happened that we did, but these groups are starting to want documented proof of that. And that holiday weekend was months ago. Okay, it was beyond what I would have expected them, but they were required to show proof. And so besides implementing the practices that are there, the act of showing compliance, of documenting proof that you're doing what you say you are doing, is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Putting into practice, documenting proof to show compliance over time are the 2 big things that we're seeing as you implement reasonable standards. By the way, this whole thing about implementing practices and documenting proof is not just limited to cyber insurance. For example, if you deal with the ratings agencies, you'll find that they may want you to do something similar to this. There's all sorts of organizations that may require this if you're involved with them. But the last thing then about how do I meet the reasonable standards requirement? If you want to find the full guide, you can find it here. Now, that's a long URL. If you want to write it down, that's fine. But it will likewise be in the summary handout that's available. And so you'll find that URL in that thing too. But the full guide can be found there if you want to read that. Now, I know we're just about out of time. And we talked about a lot this morning as we talk about reasonable standards and talk about what it means to meet that. Undoubtedly, there's questions. And if you've got questions, feel free to type them into the question and answer chat, as we'd love to talk about them today right on. But if you're watching the webinar replay off YouTube, or if you found this link someplace else, feel free to grab the handout, as that link is also below, or feel free to contact us in any of the methods that you see here, as we would like to help you go ahead and learn and meet this reasonable standards guideline that is becoming something more and more prevalent for all of us as we deal in IT. All right. Now, I don't know if there's any questions that anyone has that you'd like to talk about. If there is, please feel free to go ahead and begin typing them into Q&A, as we'd love to do that, love to participate in that. But as we talk about that, I know question that I get asked a lot about implementing cybersecurity is just how much does it cost? Interestingly enough, if you look at the Center for Internet Security, they've also provided some guidelines on what a company can expect to pay with regards to IT, what they see over their large ecosystem that they deal with, and that might be another document you will look at. All right. Well, I don't see any questions coming into the Q&A. Shauna, do you have anything else to add on that? If you do, feel free to pipe in. So for right now, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you all for joining us. Glad you participated in this. And feel free to contact us if you'd like to talk more about what cyber insurance expects and how you can meet the reasonable standards requirement. Have a good day. See you later. Bye-bye.